MBA from Wake Forest, you'd think between those two you could get a job. But then you get a call to the ministry, which may or may not make sense with your educational background up to that point. And he has an MDiv from Sangre de Cristo Seminary. I'm hoping you'll also talk about that. Many of my best friends from undergraduate days did their seminary work at Sangre de Cristo. I always thought it was for the sake of the view. He has the selected letters of Gordon Clark. Gordon Clark in here is correspondence, and I just bought a copy. And I'll get it signed because I'm really looking forward to this. And then this is Dr. Clark, about 40 years younger than I ever knew him, as the cover for the biography. He was in his early 70s when I first met him, and he was always just, I'm pretty sure he went to sleep in a light gray three-piece suit with a skinny black tie, which is what he had every day in class. I don't remember a day where it wasn't a three-piece suit.
He wore a Western tie once.
He wore a Western tie once. A string tie, one of those bolo things. Yeah, but that was it. It was a three-piece suit all the time for everything. So, but he never looked this young.
Sounds like a good man.
For that matter. If you would join me in welcoming the keynote speaker for this evening, Reverend Doug Douma.
I don't know if that's pretty loud there. I don't know if I'll get to all those topics that he mentioned, but I'll try. And if I don't, you can ask questions at the end. So, as Dr. Davis was mentioning, this seems very loud to me. Is it loud for you?
No.
No, it's not. It really is.
As Dr. Davis was mentioning, he was there probably, I think it's about 40 years ago. Carl Henry came to speak here at Covenant College, and Gordon Clark had the opportunity to introduce him. And Gordon Clark went and took Carl Henry's books and stacked them on the table, and that was his introduction to Carl Henry. He didn't say a word about him, just this is everything Carl Henry wrote. So we might do this as well for Gordon Clark. And it's a little bit like a circus car here, clown car. And this isn't everything that Dr. Clark wrote, but it's some of them. And this gives you maybe a little bit idea about what you're getting into when you have this problem where you like Dr. Clark's writings and then you have to read all these because they're just too interesting. So there is a bottom to this box. There we go. There is some of his writings. So it's one way to introduce a man is to show what he has written. But of course that's not the all of him. It was what I first got to know Dr. Clark. In fact, this is the very copy that I first read when I read Dr. Clark's writings, An Introduction to Christian Philosophy, which is not an introduction to Christian philosophy. It's quite challenging, but worth reading for sure. So, in thinking of this speech, I thought of his Covenant College days, and so I want you to imagine that you are a Covenant College student on summer break in 1973, and you hear a rumor. Dr. Gordon H. Clark is coming to teach here next year. Now, some of you, you're Covenant College students already, so imagining that you are a Covenant College student is not particularly difficult. And some of you were actually Covenant College students in 1973, so it might not be difficult at all to imagine such a thing. College here was similar from what I can tell. This is my first visit here, but college was small, smaller than it is now. It was part of the RPCES, a different Presbyterian denomination, but still Presbyterian as it is now, it was then. And this rumor happens. Dr. Gordon H. Clark is coming to teach here next year. And some people are very interested in this rumor, and some professors maybe not as interested, but many students are very interested. Some even transfer here from other colleges just to take Dr. Clark's classes. And so the question is, why is a 71-year-old man, semi-retired, that teaches philosophy of all subjects, why is this so interesting? Why would the interest be there when this rumor occurred? And so in the speech today, I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why his coming to Covenant College was of interest. And in the process of speaking about these 3 reasons, I hope I might in some way adequately introduce to you the life and work of Dr. Gordon H. Clark. But before I do that, I wanted to mention, in all the records that I found, it says that Gordon Clark started here in 1973, and that seems to be impossible to me because in his writings, in his letters, he was teaching in October and November of '73 at Geneva College. So, as you philosophers know, you can't be in 2 places at one time. Maybe Lutherans struggle with that. I grew up Lutheran, but maybe the Reformed thinkers, we don't believe you can be in 2 places at one time. Philosophy jokes. I got the right audience here. For those who are listening to us or watching the video, maybe I'll have an opportunity to note some of the people here. In the about the guest speakers, it mentions me as Gordon Clark's son-in-law, which is not true. But Dr. Clark's actual son-in-law is here, Wyatt George, as our Dr. Clark's daughter, Betsy, grandson Nathan Clark George, and a number of his students. So we are very blessed with this excellent gathering here today. So the 3 reasons why were students and professors interested in Gordon Clark coming to Covenant College. These are the 3 that I'll discuss. 1, he was one of the most notable Christian thinkers of his era. He was one of the most notable Christian thinkers of his era. 2, he was a witness to many of the major events of 20th century American Presbyterian history. He was a witness to many of the major events of 20th century American Presbyterian history. And 3, he was an endearingly unusual individual. That was the best way I could describe that, endearingly unusual. Most of his quirks and oddities were endearing. They weren't too off-putting, although maybe sometimes he was rough on the students. But other oddities were endearing. So let's look at that first point. He was one of the most notable Christian thinkers of his era. In the Presbyterian Philosopher, which is the biography of Gordon Clark, which I'll have available after the talk if you're interested in it, I attributed Gordon Clark's mindset to be principally formed by 2 factors. 1, his upbringing under a father who was an old school Presbyterian minister. And secondly, his training in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned his PhD in 1929. It's important to note that it was very rare, it was then as it is now, to earn your PhD in philosophy, particularly as a Christian. And so this was somewhat unusual at the time. In fact, Dr. Clark, here's a chance to show the other book. In the selected letters which we published this year, Tom Giudice of the Trinity Foundation, who's here as well, we edited this collection this year. One of the letters in there comes from J. Gresham Machen, the founder of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, who was friends with Dr. Clark when Dr. Clark was a young man. And Machen writes to Gordon Clark, who is a philosophy professor, and Machen says, "We can certainly be thankful for a man like you, who is not a minister and is even a university professor, and yet is not ashamed to be called a Christian." So he was in this position, especially there in the days of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, when being a Christian was difficult. But Dr. Clark was there, and he went along with Machen in his efforts to reform the church. But looking at Dr. Clark's thought, we might say that, not without a critical eye, that Presbyterianism beat out the secular philosophy. So those are the 2 influences: his father, old school Presbyterian minister, and then the secular philosophy, particularly the ancient Greeks that he studied at Pennsylvania. But it was not without a critical eye. Dr. Clark rejected, actually, the Scottish common sense realism philosophy of his Presbyterian forebears, including his own father. And he became even more convinced of the futility of non-Christian philosophies in establishing any knowledge whatsoever. That was his big area of interest, the study of knowledge, what we call epistemology. But this doesn't mean that Clarke had no use for secular philosophy, that he eschewed it and was just some fundamentalist Bible reader. In fact, Clarke wrote 2 histories of philosophy. One, he was a contributor, it was called A History of Philosophy in 1941. And then he wrote his own book, Thales to Dewey, in 1957, also a history of philosophy. And I believe that was probably his biggest seller because that was used at a lot of colleges and seminaries. A lot of the former Clarke students here might remember using Thales to Dewey. But Clarke also wrote on secular philosophers like Plotinus. And one point I loved in one of his letters, at a low point in his career when trouble was brewing in the church, he said, maybe I'll just find a job as a professor of philosophy and just become, in his own words, a mediocre Plotinian. You probably will never find, you could probably search the whole internet, that might be a unique phrase, a mediocre Plotinian, Gordon Clarke. By the time Gordon Clarke came to Covenant College in 1973, or be it 1974, he had, on my count, published 22 books. By the time of his death in 1985, his output had swelled to include 38 published books, and another 14 or so were published posthumously. In addition to his published books, he wrote at least 351 articles for various publications. His output was so broad that Carl Henry, who he once introduced here with Carl Henry's books, that Carl Henry once wrote that Gordon Clarke's writings was a wide and deep swath. He wrote on ethics, Christian education, philosophy of science, philosophy of language, logic, historiography, and then on Christian doctrinal questions, including predestination, the Trinity, faith, sanctification, the atonement, and various others. So you will almost certainly run into Clarke on some study of some philosophy or some Christian doctrine. It's almost inevitable that you will come across some of his writings. But through all this, Gordon Clarke stood for the vow that he had made as a Presbyterian minister, his vow to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And I write in his biography, in fact, this seems to be his driving factor, what really grounds him. He wants to develop a philosophy based on that Westminster Confession. He first vowed as a ruling elder in the old mainline PCUSA in the 20s, and then as a teaching elder in the OPC in 1944. His philosophy, which has been alternately called presuppositionalism, dogmatism, or scripturalism, was above all guided by this understanding of the Christian religion as outlined in the Westminster Confession of Faith. So, again, we come back to that question. If his philosophy is grounded in the historic confession of the Presbyterian Church, why was his work particularly notable? I was thinking about that question. I said, this is difficult to answer. Why is his philosophy particularly notable? Well, he wrote on so many areas. I note some of the contributions he made to areas including the question of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, the inerrancy of Scripture. One of my favorites, Lapsarianism. If you don't know what Lapsarianism is, have fun, go read about that. And also the problem of evil was a major area in which Dr. Clarke made contributions. But above all else, all this wide and deep swath, despite all of this, I think Gordon Clarke's greatest impact or greatest interest, what got me interested in his thought, is his epistemology, that question of the study of knowledge. How do we know anything? How do we know what we know? Is the Bible the answer, or is there some other path for our knowledge? And so for the necessary brevity we have for our speech, I'm going to just focus on that particular aspect of his thought, his epistemology. And the best source for his epistemology is that 1965 Wheaton Lectures. So the Wheaton Lectures are in this. The first book of his I read, this Introduction to Christian Philosophy, has his Wheaton Lectures, where Gordon Clarke went to Wheaton College and gave 3 lectures. Interestingly enough, this was in 1965. He had sort of been kicked out of Wheaton College, pushed out in 1943. So he came back to the college where, for a while, I think that I was thinking that where he gave this speech was in a hall named after the man who pushed him out of the college. But I think that was actually wrong. It was in a different hall, but he very well could have been also in that hall. But those actually came out first in his Festschrift in 1968, which is somewhat of a rare book. If you find copies and don't want them, give them to me. They're worth about $100 for this rare copy of his. So that's where you can look at his Epistemology. And it's there where he focuses and explains the importance of foundational axioms in philosophy. He says, if you start philosophy, you have to start somewhere. So you have to start with an axiom, some assumed starting point. And Dr. Clark would note that all philosophies start with some assumed starting point. Empiricism starts with the validity of sensory perception. Rationalism starts with pure logic. Christianity, in Clark's view, starts with the truth of the Bible. And so when non-Christians complain that you're starting with this unproven axiom, this, I believe the Bible, when a non-Christian complains about that, you can say, that's a problem you have too, because your philosophy also starts with some unproven assumption. In fact, it must start with some unproven assumption if it's going to start at all. But then, since we have these assumed starting points, how do we tell that Christianity is better? That's where Clark looks at comparing the systems built upon those axioms. And so he wants to compare the various systems in their logical consistency. How clean are they within themselves? Are there contradictions within the system? And then their explanatory power. Is Christianity better at answering questions than another philosophy? And I think for me, one of those big areas in which, through Dr. Clark's work, that I saw Christianity be so far superior to other philosophies is that area of ethics. And the is-ought problem, that we cannot determine how things ought to be based on the way we see things as they are in the world. And so empiricism and other philosophies fail utterly at giving us any ethics. So Christianity succeeds. We compare the two, and we might have good reason to choose Christianity as superior. And so this is how Clark explains it in Introduction to Christian Philosophy. He writes, axioms, whatever they may be, and in whatever subject they are used, are never deduced from more original principles. They are always tested in another way. If a philosopher ponders the basic principles of Aristotle, Kant, or even Sartre, he will do so by considering how well the author succeeds in solving his problems. So too it should be with Christian revelation as an axiom. We must ask, does revelation make knowledge possible? Does revelation establish values and ethical norms? Does revelation give a theory of politics? And are all these results consistent with one another? We can judge the acceptability of an axiom only by its success in producing a system. Axioms, because they are axioms, cannot be deduced from or proved by previous theorems. Clark's life work then was to show the inconsistency of various non-Christian philosophies and the consistency and explanatory power of Christianity. And this is something that he felt it couldn't be done with just a single argument, like those who employ the so-called transcendental argument for the existence of God. Rather, for Clark, the various philosophies must be addressed in their own right and be proven false. And we must find contradictions within those philosophies. Now, he certainly couldn't write across all philosophies, each and every philosophy mankind has ever devised. There's far too many. But he did write against the main contenders. And by showing them false through their logical contradictions and weak in their inability to answer those important questions of philosophy, he then opens the door for the consideration of the Christian faith, which he then argues is consistent, logical, and answers many of our most profound questions about God, men, and things of the world. And so that's what, actually, when I started to write the biography, I realized that in each one of his books, the first 90% was a critique of secular philosophy. We are so grounded in the world's thought And he spends 90% of the time critiquing the alternatives, and at the very end he has a little sliver, and this is the Christian construction, is the way he phrases it. Well, I said, somebody needs to put these all together. You don't want to read 44 books, you just want to read one. What if we put all of Ford and Clark together? And that was what I started on, as a compendium, a source of Ford and Clark's constructive criticism. But very quickly I learned that it's important to see the historical context. And so the biography project was born. Where were we? Let's see. Yeah, when I first found Clark's idea, I was struck by the immensity of this starting with the assumed truth of the Bible. I found this to be something far more substantial than, say, the Reformed epistemology of Alvin Plantinga and others. From Plantinga, I had read that Christianity, to believe in God, is not irrational. And I thought to myself, not irrational? I want to know the truth. I don't want to just know that what I'm thinking is not irrational. That's not good enough for me. It's still not good enough for me. And so I kept coming back to the phrase, this is before I had read Gordon Clark, I kept coming back to this phrase that I had in the scriptures, and Dr. Krabendam can correct my Dutch. De vreeze des Herren is het begin der kennis. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That was where I was on epistemology. I kept coming back to this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And this I considered this is a true phrase. Of course, it's a biblical phrase. But this idea of fearing the Lord, when I read Gordon Clark's work and said we need to accept the whole scriptures as our truthful starting point and axiom, I said that is having fear of the Lord. That's where we start with our epistemology. That's where Gordon Clark started with his. And so, while this is entirely too short account of his philosophy and epistemology, we'll move on to other elements here. The second reason why you as a student in 1973 might have been interested in Gordon Clark coming here was because he was a witness to many major events in 20th century American Presbyterian history, which, as I note here, I wasn't aware of this when I started writing on him. I only knew about the philosophy, theology, and only in writing the biography did I come to see the importance of the history behind it. So we'll give a brief overview of him, and this is where I really should just go off the notes. I worked on this for like 4 years, so just go off the notes. So Gordon Clark, if you look at the beginning, as I mentioned before, he was the son of a Presbyterian minister, who in turn was the son of a Presbyterian minister. So he has this, he's steeped in the Presbyterian tradition. But then, and he actually, what's a lot of people have found interesting is he comes to the Christian faith. He makes his confession of faith when he's 13 years old at a rally of Billy Sunday, who,
Really?
if you know your history, Billy Sunday was a Major League Baseball player who became a preacher. And he would go on tour, and Dr. Clark saw him, this famous preacher in Philadelphia in 1915 when he was 13 years old. So he later goes on to study French at the University of Pennsylvania. I might note that's, for those who don't always associate that with Harvard and Yale and Princeton, it is an Ivy League school. It was certainly a high-level place. He had some fantastic professors there. He graduated with his degree in French, and then he went on to study for his PhD in philosophy. And while there, he became more and more connected with J. Gresham Machen, that founder of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. His father was also friends with Machen, and they would invite Machen in this reforming movement, at one point it was called the Covenant Union. They would invite them to use Dr. Clark's father's church for their meetings. So they were big proponents of this fundamentalist separation from the church. So Dr. Clark found J. Gresham Machen to be the real pinnacle in the Christian faith. He was an intellectual man. He wasn't just a church leader who was, saying weak things, but he actually stood and had, on conviction, had written very detailed books and was very much a scholar. And so Dr. Clark looked up to Machen, and then he also looked up to a man named William Romaine Newbold. And I think just you can search, if you search hard enough, you'll find a little footnote in my book about William Romain Newbold. And he was the philosophy professor, one of the philosophy professors there at Pennsylvania. And he became Dr. Clark's dissertation advisor. Well, one of the most interesting things about Newbold is that he became famous for claiming, it turns out in error, claiming that he had solved the famous Voynich manuscript. Is anyone familiar with the Voynich manuscript? It was a document found by I think he was Polish, collector of antiquarian books named Voynich, and still to this day, it hasn't been solved, and cryptographers continue to work on this. It's one of the unsolved problems in cryptography. Well, William Romain Newbold had a chance to hold on to these documents for a while in Pennsylvania. He claimed he had a solution. He actually ended up dying early, I think by food poisoning, if the record shows right. Dr. Clark spoke at his funeral. Dr. Clark was the only student to speak at his funeral. The rest were professors and others. And then a few years after Newbold died, it came out, someone proved that Newbold's solution was an error. So there's a little bit of a tangent about one of his philosophy professors. But Dr. Clark found, so after he graduated in Pennsylvania, he stayed there as a professor, or actually as an instructor. So for 12 years he was working as an instructor. They would never promote him to an associate or assistant professor. So he started thinking, well, maybe I should look somewhere else. And in 1936, he took a visiting professor position at Wheaton College, hired by his friend J. Oliver Buswell, and then the next year he accepted a full-time position there as an assistant pastor. And so for 7 years, Gordon Clark was at Wheaton College with J. Oliver Buswell, his friend, who was also part of that reforming movement in the church. And Dr. Clark would have some good years and some bad years there. With Buswell for the first 3 years as president, Dr. Clark had a Calvinist there as the president, was a great defender of his views. And then Buswell got pushed out, and then Clark found opposition from professors and the head of the Bible department who were not Calvinists. So the last few years of his time at Wheaton were not as enjoyable as his earlier years. But while Clark was at Wheaton, he taught an almost uniquely gifted set of students. He had future Christian leaders in his classes, including Carl Henry, Edmund Clowney, who was later president of Westminster Seminary, Harold Lindsell, Paul Jewett, E.J. Carnell, and a variety of others. They all considered Clark, many of them considered Clark to be their greatest influence as a professor. The late Billy Graham also was a student of Dr. Clark's and took at least one of his classes, and that did not go particularly well. Some of you who might have already gotten ahead of this speech and read the book, you'll know that there was, according to one student, I found this in the Wheaton archives, an audio recording of a former student who was there. His name was Samuel Faircloth. He was later interviewed for the Wheaton archives. There was a medieval philosophy class, and Dr. Clark was teaching, and Billy Graham stood up in the back of the class, and according to Samuel Faircloth, he looked Dr. Clark in the eye and pointed at him and said, "Doc, you're cold." Dr. Davis mentioned a minute before the speech that Dr. Clark was known for a sort of opposition to emotions, and emotionalism. We can explain what he means. Why would someone be opposed to emotion? We can explain that later. But Billy Graham points at Dr. Clark and says, "Doc, you're cold." And Clark immediately responds and says, I wrote here, in a Spock-like way, almost a Spock-like way, which some people told me Dr. Clark reminds them of Spock. He said, "I prefer to remain cold." That was his response. I prefer to remain
It's well
cold.
considered.
So while cold for Billy Graham meant something like lacking evangelistic passion, for Clark it had connotations of a level-headedness, a consideration. Because he was a philosopher, not an emotional person. But as I mentioned, Dr. Clark was forced to resign in 1943 when complaints from the head of the Bible department, Henry C. Thiessen, convinced the board of trustees of the danger of Dr. Clark's views. You'll have to read the record to see why they were dangerous. But the one I'd like to mention, if I have one critique of Dr. Clark in the book, is that I thought it was overboard when he asked his students to go to the chapel speakers, and rather than being moved by the eloquence of their biblical speeches, he had the students write down the logical fallacies that they would find in the speakers' sermons. So they would come back not with a summary of the sermon, but a list of logical fallacies. And the various speakers and faculty were not excited about that. But that was just a minor issue. That wasn't what ended up causing the big trouble there. So in 1943, after Dr. Clark left, he stayed at Wheaton campus for a while as a representative of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, helping students there, convincing many of them to attend Westminster Theological Seminary. And he thought, maybe this is the time God is calling me into ministry. But he was already 42 years old. So this was a little strange, but his father was a minister, his grandfather was a minister, his great-grandfather was a ruling elder in Scotland. And so he applied for ordination in the church. And then, I'm skipping a bit, but in the next 4 years here are what many have called the Clark-Van Til controversy. And I write about this in 3 chapters in the book. The controversy in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church dealt with Gordon Clark's ordination and some of his theological views. What I found interesting was that at Wheaton, it was because Dr. Clark was too Calvinistic. So certainly in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, he would fit right in, or one might think, but there were other issues, even related to his understanding of Calvinism, that, correct understanding, I might add. No, that's my view of it. But even there, he found people fighting against some of his views. So I'll not get into that controversy. That can be many lectures of its own. So after these 4 years, Dr. Clark felt that he would be more effective in another denomination. He had already taken a job at Butler University in Indianapolis and had transferred his credentials to the United Presbyterian Church. It's interesting that it was there at Butler. He stayed at Butler as a professor for 28 years. This is in Indianapolis. It was there, not at a Christian college, but a secular university, where he finally got some peace of mind. He didn't have these Bible professors upset with him. He wasn't having arguments in the library with Dr. Krabendam or various other challenges to his teaching. But he had a quiet time there at Butler. And that allowed him to have a stable life, raise his children there, and also to get involved in a local church. And so he ended up actually becoming a pastor of the United Presbyterian Church there for some time, as well as professor there at the seminary. That church, again, had problems. One of the things I mentioned in the biography is that Dr. Clark moved, I think it's 6 denominations, and it wasn't his fault. The denominations, like the United Presbyterians, would go liberal, and he would lead his church to leave that denomination. And so after 10 years there with the United Presbyterians, he left. One of the things I wrote here, something that I didn't mention in the biography, I wanted to mention some things for those who have read the biography already. I wanted to mention some things that I've learned since then, or maybe didn't put in the biography. And one of them is that in Dr. Clark's files there at Butler, his faculty file, well, one interesting thing is there was a complaint that he let the students out too early, but another interesting thing is that he had an invite to a meeting there at Butler to meet with Senator John F. Kennedy, at the time senator, not yet president. And there's no indication of whether he met with Senator Kennedy or not, but given his views, probably he did not meet with Kennedy. So by the time Dr. Clark had come to Covenant College in 1973, he had already been through 5 denominations and many church struggles, including the one with his own name on it. There at Butler, he was forced to retire. He was supposed to retire at 70. They let him stay an extra year, so he stayed till he was 71. And you might think that this was the end of it, but he decided he wanted to continue teaching. So he came here to Covenant actually for 10 years, and he taught as well in the summers at Sangre de Cristo Seminary, where I attended in Colorado. He also would teach at the Winona Lake School of Theology in Indiana in the summers, and he would teach at Pensacola Theological Institute in Florida and various other places. So if you look at it all together, he actually taught for 60 years in the classrooms, from 1924 to 1984. So we think of him as a philosopher and as an author, but most people would have known him as an educator, as a professor. In fact, one of his very first books was A Philosophy of Christian Education. So he was very interested in education as well. But for students that perhaps were not interested in his philosophy, or maybe if you're not even interested in Presbyterian history, which I don't know how anyone couldn't be interested in Presbyterian history, that's my favorite subject. If you were not interested in these things, you might have been interested, as some people were, just in Dr. Clark as a person. So that's our third point. He was an endearingly unusual individual. To give you some indication of Dr. Clark as a person, he compartmentalized his food, eating one thing at a time before moving on to the next. He'd go around in a circle around his plate. Can't let the beans touch the potatoes, touch the meat, one at a time. Probably can't even let them touch in your digestion, one at a time. He knew more of his neighbor's dogs' names than his neighbors' names.
Yes.
He loved chess, chocolate, and scrapple, a pork, cornmeal, and spice dish popular where he grew up in Pennsylvania. Dr. Clark explained himself in a letter to Nick Barker here at Covenant College when they were working on getting Dr. Clark to start here. Dr. Clark said, "Outside professional philosophy, I write terrible poems, paint worse pictures, and play mediocre chess." That's how he described himself. Although we might agree about the artwork, truthfully it seems that Dr. Clark was pretty good at chess. He even won a chess club tournament once in Indianapolis. About Dr. Clark in the classroom, one student back in his Wheaton days commented, "When he taught Augustine or Aquinas or Spinoza, he was for a time the living incarnation of each thinker, defending a given philosopher's affirmations against all counterattack, and driving us to formulate our criticisms ever more lucidly and logically." Dr. Clark had a great sense of humor as well. He would often make jokes in the classroom. In fact, he one time gave a student a sign and said, "If it gets too boring, I want you to hold up this sign in the back of the classroom and it says joke." He would stop his lecture and give a joke. One of my favorite jokes is appropriate for our philosophically minded audience here today. Following a lecture in which Dr. Clark explained Zeno's paradox, a sort of tortoise and hare situation meant to explain how motion is impossible, Dr. Clark spoke about his publisher at the time and said that he had a book coming out and you could read about this topic he was talking about, except that his publisher is the slowest person on earth and that he would probably have pleased Zeno the Eleatic with his exhibition of no motion. So you had to be keen in on his jokes or on his philosophy to understand his jokes. But my favorite recollections are probably from Covenant's own art teacher, Ed Kellogg. Kellogg recalled, "Clark was so muscle-bound in his left hemisphere and atrophied in his right hemisphere. My impression was that artwork really frustrated him, that he couldn't master it, and he couldn't rationally figure out what the issues were here." I had the privilege not to be here for Dr. Kellogg's retirement speech, but I believe I heard most of it online. And he mentioned in his retirement speech that the student that he had taken the most art courses from him was Gordon Clark. So for over 10 years, about 10 years, Dr. Clark would come take art courses from Ed Kellogg. Dr. Clark would regularly invite students to his home to discuss philosophy. In the center of the biography, we have some pictures. One of them is of Wheaton College students, all in the Clark home about 1940, all sitting around eating apples, talking philosophy. Recently, I was asking one of Dr. Clark's students, this is another thing that didn't make the biography, I found it out more recently. I was talking to one of Dr. Clark's former students, and I asked him, as I asked many of them, did you get invited to Dr. Clark's house? Did you ever go there? And he said no, but that some other students had. I noted here 345 Buckingham Drive. I visited that a while ago in Indianapolis. Has a nice ring to it, 345 Buckingham Drive. This student mentioned that his friends had gone over, other philosophy students, but they didn't talk philosophy at all. Rather, Dr. Clark pulled out his slide projector and showed pictures of the American Southwest. It was the place that he loved the most, and probably no place did he love more than the Boquillas Canyon in Big Bend National Park. Dr. Clark's wife, Mrs. Ruth Clark, was a botanist by training, with a master's degree in 1932 from the University of Pennsylvania. Very unusual for a time, a woman having a master's degree from an Ivy League institution. One person I interviewed for the biography remembered Ruth Clark at Wheaton College from when she was just a little girl. And she remembers Mrs. Clark at the time. And someone said of Mrs. Clark, "She is so smart she could be president." That was her recollection. Someone had said this. She also remembered Mrs. Clark speaking French. In fact, this seems to be one of the connecting features. Both Dr. Clark and his wife were fluent French speakers. And I think German as well. I'm not sure about Ruth, but Dr. Clark spoke German as well. And I noted here, yeah, she's so smart she could be president, which was something with more dignity than in the present. But Dr. Clark would spend a lot of his summers out there in the American Southwest. He would do landscape drawings and paintings of what he saw there. He was an artist in the sense that he did art, never in the sense that you would purchase his art. And then when he returned from these trips in his beloved American Southwest, he would come and show his artwork to Dr. Kellogg. Dr. Kellogg recalled, "Clark had gotten a book on the perfect ideal composition in art. He came into my office once before class and almost slapped this book down on my desk and said, 'According to this book, this is a perfect composition.'" This is Ed Kellogg continuing. "He knew that the drawing or painting was just terrible, and it was. He knew it and was frustrated that he couldn't approach it and do something that came so easy to him with his left hemisphere approach." Some of the other things that I found during my more recent discussions with former students and acquaintances, I spoke with not a student, but a son of a student. So the father was the father was Charles Svensson. He was a student of Dr. Clark's at Wheaton College. And Charles had actually lived in their home. At Wheaton College, the professors would often have a student or two living in their home. So there was a number of students through the years that lived at Dr. Clark's house there in the 1930s and 40s. So the father was Charles Svensson. The son I talked to was John Svensson. So John had never met Dr. Clark, but he said to me that his father would regale him with stories of Dr. Clark. You know, how many people's parents actually tell about their professors? That's very unusual. John explained that his father Charles had himself had a deaf father who was not an academic nor a Reformed Christian. So he found in Dr. Clark a father figure of sorts for him. In the father, Charles fell in with the philosophy students, including Paul Jewett and E.J. Carnell, who some of these names might ring a bell if you read a lot of Presbyterian thinkers in philosophy. And then this Charles Svensson also followed those other students, Jewett and Carnell, to Westminster Seminary, probably on Dr. Clark's advice, go attend Westminster. And then later on, after they had all graduated, Charles had taken a pastorate out in California. And Dr. Clark came and visited him. And I think this could have been the time Dr. Clark gave lectures at Fuller Seminary in 1952 called the Peyton Lectures. This may have been when he came out there. And he was there with Charles. And Charles said to him, "Don't you want to hang out with Paul Jewett and Edward Carnell? These are the big minds, the big guys." And Charles was serving at a church 10 miles away there from Fuller. And Dr. Clark responded to that question, "Do you want to hang out with Paul Jewett and Edward Carnell?" Clark responded, no, they'll just ask me a lot of questions, and I want to have a good time. I forgot to mention, they went to Disneyland, so that's why.
Oh.
Dr. Clark and his former student were at Disneyland, which might be hard for some of you to envision. I might also note, as I already have, that we've published Dr. Clark's letters, a best of collection. We've been able to find about 900 of his letters. This is about the best 150 of them. We took out business correspondence and things that don't make for great reading. But we have letters in there between Dr. Clark and J. Gresham Machen, with Cornelius Van Til, with J. Oliver Buswell, Carl Henry, many others, many names that are pretty famous in the history of Presbyterian Church. So you can see his interest, his influence there. Before I had mentioned that I had started out wanting to write this summary of Dr. Clark's thought before I wrote the biography. And I had even chosen a title for it. I was going to call it, the title of the book, The Ocotillo is Not a Cactus. So I thought I might end the story where I started off on my work with Dr. Clark, thinking about cacti. That's where I started. So here's a story of Dr. Clark's recorded on an audio lecture. It shows you something of his philosophy. The importance of definitions is a key element in his thought. But it also shows you something of his passions, the American Southwest. And it should also challenge you to think about what you know and what you don't know. So there's a series of lectures recorded from Gordon Conwell Seminary in 1981. And this is a section of it. Dr. Clark says, I'm out of water here. Dr. Clark says, you know, out west in Arizona, in southern Arizona, in the deserts, there are cacti. And at this time of the year, or within a few weeks now, the desert will not merely blossom like the rose, it will much outdo the rose. Therefore, cacti flowers are far more beautiful than any roses, and they are simply gorgeous. If you go out there at the proper time, you will see a plant that goes about 12 to 15 to 20 feet tall. Its name is the Ocotillo, and it has beautiful red blooms on it. Well, one day I went into the ranger station and looked at the exhibits there. And in one of the rooms on the wall, there was a painting, an oil painting of an Ocotillo. And of course, there were Ocotillo growing outside, and underneath, amongst some other little bits of information on a placard, it says, the Ocotillo is not a cactus. There is something an Easterner wouldn't guess, you know, because the Ocotillo has thorns, and you better be careful about touching it. And to the unaided eye, it looks very much like the other cacti. As I went to the ranger desk, and there was a man there, I said, you have a picture in the other room there, a nice painting of an Ocotillo. And underneath it, it says, it is not a cactus. Oh yes, that is right. Ocotillo is not a cactus. I said, would you please tell me, what is a cactus? He looked at me. Nobody has ever asked me that question before. Guess not many philosophers got there. He says, I don't know, but the head ranger is coming back in just a few minutes. If you can wait, why, we'll ask him. I said, why, yes, I'm not in any hurry, and very beautiful, and I'll just enjoy the view and all. Well, the main ranger did come back, and so I said, would you kindly tell me, sir, what is a cactus? He said, I don't know, but I'll look it up for you. And so he got out some of these books, and he gave me a pretty fair statement of what a cactus is. I later found a better statement than that one, but he made a try. Then Dr. Clark explains, so you have to define your terms, you know. And in particular, when you're doing apologetics, you have to understand botany, as his wife has her master's degree in. And you have to know what a cactus is, as opposed to an Ocotillo, which isn't a cactus. I wish you can all go to Arizona this summer and see some Ocotillos and some cacti. Let's see, you might even get so disgusted with this course that you might leave early and get there in the middle of May. But early May and middle of May is the best time to visit Arizona, and pull this joke on the rangers because they don't know what cacti are. And so let's see, what else? Do we have anything else here? So yeah, I'm working on a lecture that I'll be giving at an institute this summer, and that's that's what the lecture is going to be about, the importance of definitions. That's a real central point within Dr. Clark's philosophy. So we will close it there, but allow questions. And I wanted to, maybe we can try to keep, if you have questions, keep them, well, I'll try my best to address any, but we'll keep the most difficult questions for the philosophers tomorrow. All right, thank you. Any questions? Okay, thanks. Yes?
You spoke of the work of Machen as being involved in a fundamentalist separation.
Yes.
And then later you referred to it as a reforming movement. I wonder if you could explain those two terms in your understanding.
Well, I think probably a reforming movement might be a better term. Because in fact, Machen didn't separate, he got kind of kicked out of the church. I actually noted in the biography that Dr. Clark left with those conservatives when they formed a new church. But they were trying to continue the true witness of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, the PCUSA. So in a sense, they were reformers. But within that first year after the Orthodox Presbyterian Church formed, there was a separation. The Bible Presbyterians left. Well, when the Bible Presbyterians left, in my opinion, they were more true separatists because they split over less central issues than the gospel. In the fundamentalist modernist controversy, those 5 fundamentals about the validity of miracles and the virgin birth and the inerrancy of scriptures, the people that were denying those 5 fundamentals were not continuing the true witness of the church. But in the next year, when the Orthodox and Bible Presbyterians split, I would call that a greater separation. So I probably misspoke if I called him a separatist. He would accept the term fundamentalist to an extent, but he much more considered himself reformed and a reformer. Yes?
You went to Sangre de Cristo, of course, where Dr. Clark taught. I was just curious, did you go there because you had an interest in Clark, or did you develop your interest in Clark when you were there?
Yeah, I knew of Dr. Clark's writings before. I was looking into a variety of seminaries. I didn't want to spend a lot of money. And Sangre de Cristo had an attractive price tag on it. So I came and visited there with the idea of also knowing that Dr. Clark's, some of his papers and all of his books were there. And that was very enticing to me, as also the presence of Dr. Clark's daughter there as the librarian. And so I remember one of the times I went there, and the seminary, it sits high up on 9,000 feet elevation there in the mountains, and Dr. Clark's daughter lives a mile or so down from the seminary, and I wanted to visit her, tell her my interests, say, I want to write a book about your father, and I was kind of terrified to do that, because what if she says no? One of the children there at the seminary, who was about 8 years old, who was a grandson of her, got in the car with me and said, I'll show you where. So I drove with this 8-year-old, he's telling me where to go. We show up and knock on the door, terrified, and she turned out to be just the most friendly lady, just really nice. And so I was won over by that experience, but also in my visit to Sangre de Cristo Seminary, the president there, I noticed something very different. The president with his 13 children, homeschooled, I didn't see any aggressive discipline. These were 13 children that were all well-behaved, all intelligent. There was something unique going on there. And I said, I not only want to study here in books, but I want to see what's going on with these families. And so I very much learned a lot about Christian life as well at seminary. And that's why I argue that on-site seminary is very valuable. There are distance learning programs. You can learn some, but being there with the people that have been through the Christian life is a valuable experience. So yeah, I was won over by the people there as well as the price tag and the presence of the books. But the fourth item was that no other seminary would allow me to have my dog. So I had to go to the mountains where they let me keep my dog.
Now we know you're a true Clark.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I don't know if it was Dr. Clark who reached out to Covenant, or if Nick Barker or someone from Covenant realized he was retiring from Butler, do you know how it how the conversation got started and why he was drawn here, other than there was a Presbyterian school?
Not exactly, but I think it was Nick Barker who wrote to him. But what was interesting is that Ronald Nash at Western Kentucky had invited Clark to teach there, and Clark said, "No, I'm retired." And then he got a letter from Milton Fisher at the Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. In fact, that's one that I skipped. Dr. Clark taught on the side at Reformed Episcopal Seminary,
Right.
and he said, "No, I'm retired." Well, I don't have the responses, but I'm elaborating.
Right.
But then he did come here. But it looks like Dr. Higgins might know better.
Well, as it has been explained to me, it was John Sanderson.
Yes, John
who-
Sanderson was
That
involved.
makes
who was
sense.
very involved in making that connection to bring Dr. Clark here.
Yeah, Dr. Sanderson as well as Higgins. And I think, I was talking about this earlier, I think Sanderson was at Wheaton College. I think Dr. Clark knew Sanderson from a previous life. Any other questions? Yes?
Not a question, but a point of interest. The great-grandson, Jonathan George, is sitting next to me. He was born on the campus of San Gabriel Cristo Seminary. Jonathan here is finishing a first-year student economist, and he's a son of Nathan, our song leader tonight.
Yes, excellent. I met him briefly earlier, and that's Wyatt George, for those who haven't mentioned him. And my favorite story Wyatt George told me once. Driving with Dr. Clark in Colorado, and you can correct me if I say this wrong. Wyatt says to Dr. Clark, "I heard Billy Graham just came out with a new book." Dr. Clark says, "Oh." And Wyatt says, "Yeah, I hear it's pretty good." And Dr. Clark says, "Well, I wonder who wrote it."
Fair question, fair question.
Yes.
There seems to be some interesting parallel in the approach, as you described it here, of Dr. Clark and of Francis Schaeffer, in terms of pointing out the problems
Yeah.
and other philosophies.
Mhm.
Was there any interaction between those two?
They were both well, actually, so I was reading Schaeffer the other day. He left the Bible Presbyterian Church in 1955, and so I don't think he kept his credentials, but his group later merged with Dr. Clark's group and became the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod. And then Francis Schaeffer, actually, I think it was here, gave the speech at Joining and Receiving in 1982. So there's chances that they might have crossed each other's paths, but they never really wrote much, if anything, against each other. There's two situations, there's two connections. In 1938, Francis Schaeffer was a student at Faith Theological Seminary, and he wrote a letter to J. Oliver Buswell, the president of Wheaton College, saying, "Who is this Gordon Clark guy teaching at your college? He's getting all the Presbyterians to go to Westminster Seminary. I want them to come to Faith Seminary. So, what is going on? I'm hearing rumors about Dr. Clark." And so Buswell writes back to Schaeffer explaining Dr. Clark's views, and that Buswell quite likes Dr. Clark. And then later, I'm not sure if it's published or not, in Dr. Clark's papers, he wrote one paper, I love the title, it's called "A Semi-Defense of Francis Schaeffer." So it was a critique of Francis Schaeffer with some defense of him. But in my understanding of Schaeffer's works, having read quite a few of them, and I spent a number of months at his L'Abri in Switzerland as well, Schaeffer came out of the school of Van Til and those at Westminster, but also diverged from them in some ways. I think, I'm not an expert on trying to explain how those differences are, but there are many similarities. You might group them all into a category of presuppositionalists, in the sense that they do want to look at those preconceived ideas, those biases that we bring into the discussion. So, yeah, maybe that answers some of the question. Any other questions? Maybe we'll take one more from the students. Or anyone else? Yes.
So, I'm wondering, is or was Dr. Clark's religious epistemology just purely comparative? Was it take this system, hold it up against this system, and the most plausible of the ones we have before us wins?
That's one of the two main factors. The other is that logical consistency, internal consistency. So whenever he took another pattern of thought, say empiricism was his favorite enemy, but he would seek to prove that they're logically inconsistent, that they have some contradiction within themselves.
In that case, my question would be, what was his opinion on the rationality or the appropriateness of agnosticism with respect to religious questions? Just not taking any position at all. Is that, if it's purely comparative, where does that fit?
Good question.
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I don't know much in his writings about agnosticism. I'll have to look at that or think about it. I have a feeling I might know how the Antillians might answer that, but I'm not sure how Clark might answer it. So maybe we'll end there with me stumped. All right, thank you all. And I do have both those books available, and I'm interested in getting Dr. Clark's works out, so I try to keep them as reduced as possible and sell them just a little bit more than what I get my author's discount on. So the biography I have available for $20, and the selected letters I sell for $10. So if you're interested in either of those, you can see me at that table, and we'll have good fun tomorrow as well. Thank you much.
Is Nathan?
Oh, Nathan's going to continue with one or two or how many more songs?
Could I